I would like to introduce this special meeting first by thanking Omar Dajani and Dahlia Scheindlin for taking the time to be with us and present their political project of two states Confédération Israël-Palestine during their very short visit to Paris. I would like to thank also Chibli Mallat, who will be discussing online from Lebanon. I would like also to thank the European Center for Sociology and Political Science, of which I am a member, and the head of the center is here, Antoine Vaucher, and the Center of Turkish and Ottoman, Balkanic and Central Asia Studies, represented by my colleague Hamit Bozarslan, a great specialist of the Middle East. So I would like to thank all of them for hosting the meeting. And I extend special thanks to the president of the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales for hosting us here in the line of the debates that were organized last year at the École by Hamit around the issue of the conflict, the war in Israel-Palestine. Thanks to the president for allowing us to hold the event against the order of the police. And thanks to all the persons that helped organize, particularly Léa Lamar, Sylvain Provost, and all the others, and especially in this very complicated situation. The war that started on the October 7, following the massacre by the Hamas of 1,200 Israelis, most of them civilians, and the taking of 251 hostages, has entailed an unprecedented cycle of mass killings in Gaza, over 50,000 dead, many of them women and children, destruction and starvation of the population, in disregard of international law, sustaining the charges of war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and even genocide. This horrendous conjuncture has dissipated any serious reflection on Pacific political solutions, as it has put an end to any possibility of discussion between the two camps in the public sphere. This is why it seemed to us important and urgent, besides the calls to stop the war, the mass massacre and the destruction, to invite Omar Dajani and Dahlia Scheindlin to present the political project of a confederation of two states, Israel-Palestine, that is promoted by the movement A Land for All, of which there are distinguished representatives. A Land for All is an organic Israeli-Palestinian movement created from human rights activists and professionals, lawyers, academics. They have been working on this project for more than 12 years. This invitation is part of an initiative we took with my colleague, the economist Thomas Piketty, who expresses regrets for not being available today, with Sari Hanafi, professor of sociology at the American University of Beirut, who maybe is with us online, and with Samuel Moyne, professor of law and history at Yale. An initiative to write an open letter to the European Union asking the EU to take drastic measures to stop the war and support peace efforts, and to consider the political project of the two states confederation instead of the traditional two-state solution. This initiative has special signification in the context of the announcement of French President Emmanuel Macron that France will recognize Palestine. The open letter was published in Le Monde and already signed by more than 500 academics and intellectuals from 36 countries, and many of the signatories are present today here online. It appeared in the Palestinian website Man News and in the Lebanese journal An-Nahar, as well in La Libre in Belgium, and will be published in other countries, hopefully. It is a great opportunity to be able to discuss in person with Omar Dajani and Dahlia Scheindlin, and with Chibli Mallat, who, as I said, is with us online in Lebanon, from Lebanon. I will present all the three before we give them the floor, and Hamit Bozarslan will make a brief introduction of his own and will moderate the discussion. So, Omar Dajani is a Palestinian-American professor of international law at the University of Pacific's McGeorge School of Law in Sacramento, California, and a leading expert on legal aspects of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. He has been, among other consulting tasks, a senior legal advisor of the PLO Negotiation Support Unit in Camp David and Taba in 1999. He joined afterwards the Office of the United Nations Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process, where he worked on peace-building initiatives before starting his professorship at McGeorge School of Law in 2003. Among many publications, he has, I mentioned just a volume he has recently co-edited with Asli Bali, a volume on federalism and decentralization in the contemporary Middle East and North Africa, which was published with Cambridge University Press in 2023, and he is co-chair of the board of A Land for All. Dahlia Scheindlin, she's a public opinion expert and an international political and strategic consultant, as well as a scholar and a writer. She specializes in public opinion research on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and peace process. She has previously worked as a senior analyst for the Washington-based global firm Greenberg Kinlam Rosner Research, and as a researcher at the Israeli Democracy Institute. She has worked on 8 electoral campaigns in Israel, a columnist in the Israeli daily Haaretz. She's also the author of The Crooked Timber of Democracy in Israel, published in 2023. And she was involved in the founding of the movement A Land for All in 2012 to 2013, and is currently a member of the Israeli Secretariat Group. And Chibli Mallat is a well-known international lawyer and an emeritus professor of law at the University of Utah. Among the positions he has held in academia, he directed the Center of Islamic and Middle Eastern Law at the University of London and was granted a Jean Monnet Chair of European Law by the European Union in 2001. He has been visiting professor in many places, among which Harvard, Princeton, Yale, and here at the École des études en sciences sociales. And he was a candidate to the presidential elections in Lebanon in 2005-2006. Hopefully he will be a candidate again at some point. Among the books he published, I'll mention The Middle East into the 21st Century with Ithaca Press in 1996. Many thanks to him also for being with us this evening.
Merci beaucoup, chère Gisèle. So I will also speak in my broken English. I am sorry for that, but I am really very happy that we can gather together on this very particular and important issue. Of course, our meeting takes place amid a tragedy, and this tragedy amplifies from day to day. That's not only a war of annihilation, namely in Gaza, but war is conducted by an openly supremacist power, and the war has taken almost a biological and social Darwinist dimension in Gaza. And this power does not even dissimulate its ambitions. And one has the impression that war has become the only policy, only reality, and only raison d'être of government of Netanyahu. This power is an unrestricted power. It is unrestricted because it was successful in blurring our categories of perception. It was able to make us believe that the Palestinian issue is not a national issue, not an issue of a people, but an issue of Hamas. It means an issue of terrorism. And today, our urgent task, more than ever, is, of course, to ensure the survival of Gaza, but also to find new alternatives. The alternatives that mean, speaking about alternatives, that means also to find alternative voices that reject both Israeli supremacism and policy of denial on one side, and that rejects also any form of jihadism or Islamism within the Palestinian society. That means also that in the worst condition of its post-1948 history, Palestine has to propose and produce new alternatives. And similarly, the Israeli society also very much weakened, has to produce also and propose new alternatives. More than ever, we need to mobilize our political imaginary. The political imaginary can go well beyond the realities that we observe in the field. And we know that by the past, many thinkers have asked themselves how to resolve the national issues, how to overcome the national issues without war and even without a formal state building. How to overcome the principle of the states as the sole actor in complex spaces. One should just remember the contribution of the Austro-Marxists, the so-called Austro-Marxists, these Marxist theoreticians in Austria and Hungary, such as Otto Bauer and Karl Renner in the beginning of the 20th century. For them, it was extremely important to ensure or to invent new forms of representations, new forms of national expressions, and envision forms of federalism, not just one single form, but forms of federalism. And they knew that in ethnically heterogeneous spaces, one should not impose the principle of ethnic homogeneity. The principle of ethnic homogeneity could only bring violence, pogroms, and exterminations. And they believed firmly that new forms of coexistence, it means new forms of existence, was possible. They believed also that Thanatos was not the ultimate horizon of the humanity, but together with Thanatos existed also Eros, it means life itself. And I know that these debates have also taken in Palestine in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, and after the creation of the State of Israel, both in Israel and in Palestine. While it is important to recognize unconditionally the Palestinians' rights to the statehood, while being sensitive to identity issues in both spaces, we need to imagine new forms of existence. Thus, a land for all is not only a slogan, it is not only a motto, it is not only an invitation, but also a project. This project is also the project of becoming subjects of their own history. That the Israelis and the Palestinians, they became the subjects, the co-subjects, their own space and their own time. It means their own history, their future. It means also that they have to liberate themselves from the historical burdens which block them together, that they became able to liberate themselves from their fears that imposes a biologized mortgage on the future. So with that, I will stop and give the floor to our two distinguished guests, Omar Dajani and Dahlia Scheindlin. We will organize the meeting in the following way. In the first place, they will take each 10 minutes to present the project, A Land for All. And in the second place, they will deliver us or give us the lessons that we can withdraw from the past, particularly from the Oslo process, why this process has failed, and what can be done in the future in order to have other new and successful process. So we will start maybe with Omar, if you agree, or with you. Okay, we'll start with Dahlia. The floor is yours, please.
Thank you. Thank you to everybody for joining us, and mostly thank you to all of our hosts. There are so many for giving us this platform. I also want to start by recognizing that there have been hundreds of people killed in Gaza today, every day for the last week. I'm an Israeli, and I think all Israelis need to take responsibility for this. I want to go back a little bit and talk about some of those lessons of the past as part of explaining the background and context for how we came to decide that there is a need for a different kind of solution to the end of occupation and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I won't go into prehistory, you're welcome, but I will start with the two-state solution, which when I became active, and I do, I live in Israel, I moved there in 1997 from the US, and when I was in my early 20s, in the mid-90s, the Oslo process was getting going, and we thought it was going to lead to a two-state solution, and I thought that it was the most progressive, fair, comprehensive, and comprehensible approach. Two people, two states. We thought we were very on the front line for supporting this. The process to begin negotiating, formally negotiating, the two-state solution in which Israel had its borders somewhere near 67 and the Palestinians had the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. The only formal process that began naming that solution was in the year 2000. And it lasted for about 14 years until the last serious negotiation in the year 2013-14. And so we had 14 years of negotiating for this two-state solution along the lines that were established roughly in the year 2000. And that involved the question of where would the borders be, what would happen with Israeli settlements, refugees, Palestinian refugees, from 1948, and how would Jerusalem be handled. For 14 years, those negotiations at the highest levels, official bilateral negotiations, backed by the United States and Europe, and they all failed. We've been trying this for 14 years of official negotiations, and all those negotiations failed. And that included also cycles of violence. And the reason why they failed, well, there are many reasons why they failed. Books have been written about it. But I think that the most obvious point that we sometimes miss in the individual analysis is that they failed because the two sides could not agree on the compromises they would have had to make over the issues of borders, settlements, Palestinian refugees, what to do with Jerusalem. All of what we call the core issues of the conflict, the two sides were not really willing to close the gaps between them, to make compromises that would result in the complete international partition of two separate states. Well, what happened after that? For 10 years, well, almost 10 years, between 2014 and 2023, Israeli leaders said we don't need to resolve the conflict at all. We don't need to end the occupation at all. We can manage it. We have some cyclical violence, but I disagreed, and not just me, but many of our colleagues and friends in the region thought that is no way to approach a conflict and the occupation. And the reason why I disagreed, and the reason why I think anybody who supports a solution disagrees, is because the occupation is wrong, it's immoral, it violates international law, and it's dangerous. And that's what we were saying for all of the time between the end of the failed peace process to reach two states and October 7th, when sadly we all were correct that it was extremely dangerous to have a conflict unresolved. But in the meantime, by that time we're talking about, 23 years from 2023, since the outlines of a two-state solution based on partition had been established. And geopolitically, things change. Now, geopolitically is, this fancy word, but what it really just means is that things change on the ground in ways that affect the political possibilities. And so by that time, we had, if the issue, just to take one issue, if the issue of settlers, Israeli Jewish settlers living in areas that Israel captured in 1967, we call settlements, during the year 2000, when the idea of two states was established, they had to solve the problem of about 300,000 settlers. Okay, if you look altogether between East Jerusalem and the West Bank. By this time, at present, we have about 700,000 settlers living over the area, what we call the Green Line, of the areas where Israel captured. Jerusalem was one of the major issues the two sides could not agree on. And it seems like a very obvious answer. You have a city and you just cut it in half, and the west part goes to Israel and the eastern part goes to the Palestinians. Why couldn't they agree on it? Because it's not shaped like this, it's shaped like this. And so you can't really cut it in half. And so we didn't see, and of course all of the dynamics of people living in very closely intertwined spaces in Jerusalem had only gotten more intertwined in the 25 years since the year 2000. Palestinian refugee issue. This was one of the most sensitive areas for Israelis. Israelis rejected out of hand, for the most part, certainly in public opinion, which is my expertise, all of the compromises that were proposed with relation to a solution for Palestinian refugees. And it's not like the Palestinian refugee issue went away in the meantime. It was always a core aspect of the Palestinian national identity. And if anything, as the peace process fell apart, I would say it probably took on even more importance symbolically for the Palestinian side. So how are you going to come to a negotiation or an agreement 23, 25 years later when the original agreement could not be agreed between the two sides? So we realized that there was a need for a policy framework that both recognizes the need of two sides for self-determination, but comes up with different solutions for all of the core issues, because the two sides were not actually able to close the gaps on all of at least those 4 issues, not to mention some other marginal ones. Now, I'm going to let Omar do the hard work of talking about the specific plan, but we think it's more realistic. I think the main thing that I want to get across is that beyond just coming up with a new policy solution, we looked at the process of negotiating for 2 states. We looked at the dynamics of the negotiations and their failures. We looked at the solutions that had been implemented in the meantime, the temporary framework that was established in the Oslo agreements beginning in 1993, which became very permanent. And we see everything that went wrong. And we realized that we were coming at this from different values entirely, not just a different policy framework, not just different political solutions, but that the entire understanding of who Israelis and Palestinians are, how they live together, we felt differently. I say we because now we're talking about a rather larger, community of people who found each other around the time we realized that 2 states in the partition form was never going to be implemented. And I want to just list a few of the values that I think really animated all of us who eventually searched for a different kind of policy response. One is the idea that the 2 sides must be equal. You have 2 nations. Each nation has the right of self-determination, and each of them have an equal claim to the land. And we start from the premise that as a basic state of being, these are 2 sides that are equal. They are not equal in practice. They are not equal politically right now. They are not equal in terms of military, economic power, political stability. In any way, they are not equal, but they should be. And we come to this from a presumption that we treat each other as equals within the movement that we've built, but we also put that as the goalpost for where we want to get to in any political solution. We also think that a core, in a way, of values that drives what we do is freedom of movement. I think we have understood that the restrictions, particularly the collective restrictions on Palestinians, but also the idea that 2 sides are going to be hemmed in through a hard international partition, an international border, is not going to have benefits for making each side feel good and secure and homogenous, because that's a fake, right? Israel is never going to have a homogenous society. We have 2 million Palestinian or Arab citizens of Israel. Palestinian society isn't homogenous either. We think locking people into separate spaces is maybe manageable on the Israeli side, but certainly would have detrimental effects for Palestinians on the economic and social level. When you draw a border, that makes it a very, very hard and unforgiving border. So we believe in freedom of movement. We needed a political framework to establish that. We recognize the fact that the 2 sides are interdependent. It's not just a matter of the fact that each population is not truly homogenous, but we are 14 million people at this point in a very tiny physical space. We can talk politics all we want, but an epidemic doesn't stop at geographical borders. Epidemiologists say we're one epidemiological family. Economists say that we're one economic family. So we understand that there is an interdependence, and that a framework of hard partition between 2 different states isn't going to reflect the reality of that interdependence. We will have to coordinate and cooperate on numerous issues no matter what. And finally, I would say, the realization that I came to actually after I started to support the idea of 2 states in a confederated arrangement. And that is that as somebody who I felt myself to be driven by a liberal concept of the world throughout my adult life, the idea of basing a resolution for conflict, for ethno-nationalist conflict, based on ethno-national segregation, did not seem like a very liberal perspective to me. That perspective says that people can't live together if they're different, that societies have to be ethnically separated in order to survive, and I don't believe that. I came from the US originally. I didn't believe that in the US. I don't believe that in France, and I don't believe that for Israel-Palestine. I think that we are bound together by geography, history, religion. We're sharing the same space. And I think what animates me is the idea that that is not just our fate to be bound together and interdependent. It's also an opportunity. So I'll stop there as the context and send it to Omar. Thank you.
So much for this presentation. I think that two ideas, they are very important in what you said, the issue of equality, and the second idea is that land cannot become a prison. A land must be the land of freedom, movement, not a land of fixation or constraint mobility. And I think that on that I will give the floor to Omar. Please, the floor is yours for 10 minutes, and you will have 10 minutes more in the second round.
Great, thank you very much. Before I elaborate a little bit on the practical dimensions of our project, I'd like to, first of all, join Dahlia in thanking our wonderful hosts, Gisèle and Hamit, and thanking all of you for coming today. And I also want to thank you for your generosity in having an English language session today. We will do our best, recognizing that not everyone has English as a first language here, to speak slowly, but we also really appreciate it. And hopefully we will have more French language events for our movement in the future. So thank you for that also.
They both speak very well French.
I also want to join my colleagues in bringing our attention to what is happening just across the sea from us here in the Gaza Strip. Hundreds of people, as my colleagues said, dying each day. Indeed, just since the American Israeli hostage, Idan Alexander, was released, hundreds of Palestinians have been killed by the IDF, and a ground operation begins. I would like us to take just a moment of silence to recognize that is happening as this conversation continues. And we'll talk later in the conversation about why we think it's important to continue discussing the future, maybe more important than ever to discuss the future, even as these horrors are unfolding in the present. But let me turn to the practical dimensions of the vision that we are advocating. Our movement is called two things: a land for all and two states, one homeland. And that second label, two states, one homeland, is maybe more descriptive of what we advocate. So at one level, we are pushing for something that has been an international consensus for decades: a two-state solution in Israel-Palestine. And there are aspects of what we are advocating that are very much in keeping with the two-state solution that the international community has embraced. Let me explain. We advocate for a Palestinian state to be established alongside Israel. We advocate for a border to be defined between the two states. We advocate for that border to be based on the June 4th, 1967 line. So those of you who are familiar with the map of our small country will have seen the green line, the line that separates the West Bank from Israel and the Gaza Strip from Israel. And we believe that that line should be the starting point for negotiations over a two-state solution, and that we shouldn't depart very meaningfully from that line, if at all, when we talk about where the border ultimately will be. So we believe in two sovereign states, that a Palestinian state would not be the kind of quasi-state that was imagined, for example, by President Trump when he proposed in 2020 a map of Israel-Palestine that involved a Palestinian state that looked like Swiss cheese, a Palestinian state in which Palestinians would have little control over their borders, little control over their economy, little control over even movement within their own territory. For us, that kind of two-state solution is not a solution. It's a recipe for war, not for peace. It's a recipe for domination, not for partnership. What we advocate is a different kind of two-state solution, a two-state solution that we believe actually can work. And so how is our approach different from the one that has long been advocated? Dahlia has already touched on some of the principles that define our approach, but let me speak to how those principles actually work in application. So, number one, and this will be very familiar because we're in a room full of Europeans. While the border will be based on the June 4th, 1967 line, the border we envisage, the border that we imagine for Israel-Palestine, is not the border between North and South Korea with a giant wall, or for that matter, the border that has long existed between Israel and the Gaza Strip, the border that failed so terribly to provide security to either people over these last 25 years. No, the border that we imagine is a border closer to the one that France has with Germany, with Spain, within the framework of the Schengen area, a border over which there is freedom of movement and eventually freedom of residence for all Palestinians and all Israelis. Why is that important? In a very fundamental way, this is important for both symbolic reasons and for deeply practical reasons. At the symbolic level, and Dahlia alluded to this already, we recognize that when people talk about Palestine, when Palestinians talk about Palestine, they're not just referring to la Cisjordanie, the West Bank, or the Gaza Strip. They're referring to all of what we know as Israel-Palestine. My family, for example, comes from Jaffa, which, as you may know, is just south of Tel Aviv. And so when I think of what Palestine is, it also includes the place that my ancestors came from, the place that we called home for hundreds of years. So, and similarly, when you ask many Israelis what they think of when they talk about Israel, it's not just the area along the coastal strip, Tel Aviv, Haifa, but also the places where the ancient kingdoms of the Hebrews existed, in what many Israelis called Judea and Samaria. And so we recognize, we start from a recognition that this whole space is cherished by both peoples. And that's one reason why being able to move across it is necessary. Being able to live anywhere in it is crucial. But there's also a practical set of reasons. Dahlia told you earlier about how difficult it was when the idea was separation for us to reach agreement. We were like a couple contemplating a divorce, trying to decide how to saw our child in half, right? Sorry, that was more violent than I intended. But sawing your child in half is pretty violent. And indeed, there were certain things, certain issues that made that especially difficult. As Dahlia mentioned, there are 700,000 Israelis in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem. 700,000 today. There were about 400,000 when I was involved in trying to negotiate peace, and even then we could not reach agreement. Where would the border be? If the border pushed the settlements inside Israel, then the Palestinian state became shriveled into something lacking viability. On the other hand, if all of the settlers were ordered to evacuate from the settlements, then we would be faced with a political, economic, and security dynamic inside Israel that unfortunately no Israeli leader was prepared to contemplate back then, and seems even less likely to contemplate today. We also recognize that when you buy a logic of separation, you can end up with momentum around it. We look at the population exchanges that happened in Greece and Turkey, in India and Pakistan, and what started as a limited exchange became a horrific process during which people lost their homes in the hundreds of thousands or millions of people. And so for all of these reasons, we look at that example and we say, no. And so our vision is one in which Israeli settlers would be able to remain in their homes if they are prepared to be law-abiding permanent residents of the state of Palestine. The settlements would not remain. A space of Jewish supremacy would not remain. But the settlers themselves would have an opportunity to be a part of this space. And similarly, Palestinian refugees, like my family, who have been denied the right to return to our homes in what is now Israel for more than 75 years. People living in Lebanon, people living in Syria, people living in Australia or the United States, who are attached to the places from which they came, would be able to return, become citizens of the state of Palestine, but permanent residents of the state of Israel. And while this sounds complicated, it is, of course, exactly what you have here in Europe. I am very lucky to be a French citizen, and I can vote in French national elections. And I also spend a lot of time in Greece and can vote in local elections in Greece, but not national elections in Greece. What we envisage is a similar spirit defining the regime in Israel-Palestine. And on top of that, the city of Jerusalem would be a city across which there is freedom of movement and residence for all people, but that would be a capital of two states, Israel and Palestine. I want to say a last thing, and then I'll turn it over to Dahlia to talk a bit more about our movement, and we'll talk about some of our lessons too. We recognize that arrangements of this kind are very far from what exists right now, very far, and are difficult to maintain without strong institutions. We'll talk more later about the difficult question of how we get there. How do we build a bridge from where we are today to this future that we want to grasp onto, that we want to make a reality? We will talk more about that later. But what I want to stress right now, though, is that we recognize that in order for all of this to work, we anticipate that there would be a set of confederal institutions in Israel-Palestine. Already, whatever one may think about the enmity between Israelis and Palestinians, there are already deep measures of cooperation, even in these, the worst of times between us. Already, in areas of public health and in security, very problematic cooperation because it's based on inequality, not equality, but cooperation nonetheless. But what we propose, and I encourage you to look at our website for more detail, and we're happy, especially once my friend Chibli begins asking us the hard questions about Confederation, we're happy to elaborate. But we see a human rights court, we see institutions for dealing with a range of issues from climate change adaptation to public health to security to tourism, and the list goes on. And we understand that dealing with those joint institutions together will, for a transitional period, also require international help. So our vision is one of two states, but two states in which we have Palestinians and Israelis enjoying a shared homeland that looks and gives people the rights that are similar to those that Europeans enjoy here in your countries.
Thank you, dear Omar. Maybe just one point to thank you first of all, and underline maybe two ideas that were very struck in what you said. The first one, turning the page of the 19th century. Not only turning the page of the 20th century, but turning the page also of the nationalist, social Darwinist 19th century, and turning the page of also of an eschatological history, because I think that in both cases eschatology does intervene. And the second point is that in what you said, I think that there are a lot of implications going beyond Israel and Palestine. It means that understanding maybe the sovereignty as full sovereignty and yet interdependent and shared sovereignty. Beautiful, yes. And please, Dahlia.
Thank you again, also to Omar for a great exposition. It's, I can't help but notice you're saying we should turn the page on the 19th century. I mean, what's actually happening in the world today is in a way a reversion to the 19th century in terms of norms of conquest and, dismissal of international institutions coming from some of the global powers.
Don't forget that Romania has voted for a pro-European candidate. We have at least some good news. Not everywhere, but at least some good news.
I think this is important, and I will get back to it, but I do think it's important to say that as much as it looked very inevitable that the global superpower that drives so much of what happens in the world was making common cause with a lot of countries that were perfectly happy to undermine these institutions that we've built in the second half of the 20th century, looking like we're going back to things like conquest, it's true that the world is putting up a fight. In other words, there are, since that first blast, I think, of the Trump administration, without getting sidetracked, we've had elections in Australia and Canada, and now in Romania, that show that people are choosing a different path as well. So it is hopeful. I just want to take a few minutes, I don't think I need a full 10 minutes, but to tell you a little bit about the movement that we've built. Who are we? Why are we here talking to you, other than our great, brilliant ideas, which you all now agree with? But we have actually built a group of people, and I think that the most important thing to keep in mind is that these ideas came from Palestinians and Israelis together. They didn't come from one side more than the other, and they didn't come from outsiders. I think that is one of the things that makes this a very authentic set of solutions, because we've developed them based on what we know about what's going on the ground. I think that it started in a very organic way. I mean, it can go back to around 2011, 2012, when we had, very long-term veteran Israeli journalist who had, an old friend who was, I think, a former Fatah, was he a politician, Aouni? And had, and in a way, a typical Palestinian experience of having been in jail and Israeli jails for years. And they started talking about a better approach for the kinds of, reaching the kinds of solutions we're talking about. They realized it was called a confederation. And in the very beginning, they called it something else. They called it utopia, because they thought their vision was so good. And I came along and said, don't call it utopia, because everybody will think that we have to, sacrifice in order to get there. But the idea was that they thought it was a much more idealized vision. And we do get accused of being fantastical thinkers sometimes. I do not understand the accusation of being fantastical thinkers, because I think if you try to really imagine how to implement two states based on a hard international partition, I don't think it's possible at all. I don't think it's physically possible. I don't think it's politically possible. And I think the outcome would be disastrous. So I think that actually we are much more realistic. Why do I say we are realistic? Because my experience, just like the person I mentioned on the Israeli side, definitely, I know his story a little bit better. We came to these ideas after doing a lot of time, looking at the communities of Israel and Palestine very closely, because we are either, like me, I spend my life doing public opinion research about these issues. And then I spent a lot of time going around and just getting to know the communities I was talking about. Jerusalem is a great example. When I first really started to pay attention to the dynamics in Jerusalem, I realized it cannot be divided. And it would be bad for everybody concerned if it was. But you have to physically go to the places and see them and see how intertwined the infrastructure is to know that. And I think we also, this goes back to some of our lessons learned. I think we realized that even people who were well-intentioned, building earlier phases of the peace process, such as it was, didn't always really pay attention to the way life works on the ground. And it's not an accident that the people who came to this were a political activist on one side, on the Palestinian side, and an Israeli journalist who'd been covering these issues for a long time. And then, people like me, people started gravitating together. I don't think they went around convincing anybody. People who cared about, who believed that you need to find a resolution to end the occupation and the conflict started to find each other. Some people came because they had been involved in advocating one democratic state, but realized that there's no way to advance that there's not enough, that there will never be support for it. There still isn't really support for it in the region, and that it's not really feasible. And they thought this is a better approach. It takes certain aspects of the one state solution, which are more fair, more practical, but acknowledges that there's two nations that need two states. So people found each other in those first few years. We established a little group called Two States, One Homeland, and we started talking. And we started researching, and we started advocating, and we started lecturing. And I found that even when I was invited to speak about something entirely different, like public opinion and the conflict, or the history of the negotiations, if I even mentioned something about this new idea that I've been working on with other people about two states and a confederated arrangement, there was tons of interest. People would gravitate to hearing more about it, because I think anybody who understands the region realized that managing the conflict forever and not resolving it was wrong, and that the old two-state solution was stuck. And so we got more, interest over the years. I would say the easiest community to work with has been the international community. Thank you for being here, but we know that you're interested because we always have interest from international communities. The sad part is that we have not had enough interest in general among Israelis who thought that everything was mostly okay until October 7th, with a few escalations every few years, but we could live with that. Although we did a lot of work over the last decade in trying to talk to them anyway, going to people of high school age, whether it was actually in schools or in pre-military academies or other community organizations where we could. On the Palestinian side, there's some of this kind of grassroots. But then, I would say after October 7th, suddenly everybody realized that actually things were not going so well. And we got, a great deal more demand, including from the international community. But I think that we have to recognize that in the local environment, on the one hand, we do see a lot more demand and interest for the kind of approaches that we have. And in fact, when we give talks on this in Israel now, I'm going to speak for the Israeli side for a second, we have a lot more interest, especially from young people. But I think that it is a very difficult situation among both the Israeli and Palestinian public because of the war. Every war makes both sides more belligerent, more hardline, less willing to talk about any kind of democratic-based solution. So it's a very difficult environment, but we do see a renewed interest at the same time. And there's another community that we've been working with over the years where I think we've had a lot of success, even though it was a very difficult beginning. And that, ironically, is the community of people who openly and actively supported two states through a hard international partition, what we call the classic or the traditional two-state solution. Some of those people were initially the most opposed because they felt like we were offering some radical change, that we were somehow a one-state solution in disguise. And what's interesting is that over the 13 years now, really, since we've been talking about it, I would say most people, certainly on the Israeli side, because I'm very connected with that community, and we can talk about the Palestinian side, but most people who deeply believed that it was urgent to reach a two-state solution in the classic form, at least are aware of what we are advocating, understand that it is a more updated and possibly more feasible version of a two-state solution, and many of them have come to support it, or at least do not see it as a contradiction. In survey research, we see that among, I have been able to do some survey research among Israelis and Palestinians over the years, and we see that particularly among Israelis who consider themselves to be left-wing, they have completely adopted this solution from a starting point of, a minority who supported it because they didn't know about it, but they have gone to a clear majority who support it. Centrists have shown some rise, but then a fall during the war. And on the Palestinian side, people support it almost pretty much at the same rate that they support a two-state solution. So we have a natural constituency, including in the region. People understand that we are basically aiming for the same things, but in a way, in a refreshing kind of, again, updated, practical, but also much more hopeful perspective. And that's what the movement has been trying to get across to, again, international communities, our local communities of Israelis and Palestinians, and particularly those who understand the need to end occupation and conflict through a democratic-based approach that recognizes two peoples and our interdependence. So we work with all of those communities.
Thank you so much. Thank you also for this effort. I think that it is very important to underline that when the arm speaks, maybe it can be very interesting to oppose the pedagogy of democracy and coexistence to the arms and to the demagogy. And from that point of view, from that point of view, I think that what you have explained, the support that you are trying to find and you have already found in both communities, it's a very important point. So, Omar.
Thank you. I would just add, if anyone has questions later about any aspect of public opinion in Israel, Palestine, this person happens to be the single most important survey researcher in our spaces, along with
this person happens
Khalil
to be
Shikaki.
my biggest fan.
I am her biggest fan, but I know there are many other fans too. And so if you have questions about where public opinion is right now, she is very well situated to answer them. I'd like to just turn lastly to two things. First of all, to the lessons that we need to learn from past experiences, and to the reasons why I think, and secondly, to the reasons why I think this approach is so responsive to what we Palestinians have been looking for. So those of us who were involved in the Oslo negotiations, the negotiations that began around 1993 and continued until the year 2000, resumed again in 2007, 2008, and then again in 2013, 2014, and then basically collapsed after that. But really had at their core between 1993 and the year 2000. Those of us involved in those negotiations had a constant frustration with them. We knew that we were involved in a transitional process. We were making a transition. But we didn't have any clarity about what we were making a transition from. We couldn't agree, for example, that law of occupation was relevant and applicable. The Israelis said, the Fourth Geneva Convention doesn't apply here, for example. And equally importantly, maybe more importantly, we didn't have clarity about what we were making a transition to. And so for years, there was an argument about whether our process was going to lead to a Palestinian state or to a lesser Palestinian entity, as our Israeli counterparts called it sometimes. And the lack of clarity about the end point of the negotiations, about where we were going, strengthened the hand of people who were skeptical at best, and strengthened the hand of people who were opposed at worst to this process. And so critics of the undertaking could say, where are you going? This is heading nowhere fast. Palestinian critics said, this is heading not toward Palestinian statehood, but toward permanent Palestinian submission to Israel. Israeli critics said, this is heading not to a two-state solution, but instead to a phased plan for the destruction of the state of Israel. And so one of the things that we feel very strongly about is that it's necessary going forward for us to start from the end and work backwards. That it is more important than ever for the international community, from the outside in, and for Palestinians and Israelis on the ground, bottom up, outside in and bottom up, for us to say, this is where we're heading. This is our vision for the future. To start there and then think about how you get there. And so that's why we have this very elaborated vision and why we are involved in a lot of research projects to take what is a beautiful vision and make it deeply practical and operational. And we're happy to talk about those research projects later. So one lesson is know where you're going if you actually would like to get there. Second lesson that we learned is the Oslo agreements were agreements that were premised in part on the idea that the best way to achieve security during the transition was to divide territory into little controllable pieces. So the West Bank divided up into Area A, 2 dots here, a few dots here and there, Area B, some more dots in a sea of Israeli control. And all of that was separated from the Gaza Strip. And part of the idea was, okay, this fragmentation of territory, this fragmentation of authority creates security for Israel. What we have learned is that the opposite is true. Because when we look at the different parts of this, our country, what we see is that the place where there was most separation, the place where we had a $1 billion border wall, is the place over which not only October 7th attacks were able to take place, but also the place over which 5 successive wars unfolded between 2008 and 2021. And so that idea that separation yields security turned out to be wrong, and the contrary idea that treating people with rights, giving them freedom of movement, giving them human dignity works, has been borne out by the fact that the place where there are the fewest security problems is inside Israel, where there is a population of 2 million people who consider themselves Palestinians. And so we can just look at our last 30 years of history and see that separation is not the answer and that human dignity is the answer. And of course, there is a need for security arrangements, but not security arrangements premised on assumptions that separation works. Last point I'd like to make is that we also learned that peace processes don't advance unless both parties have incentives for it to advance. And so one of the things that we are giving a lot of thought to is how do you build incentives for Israel in view of the fact that over the last number of years it has held almost all of the cards, so that you don't create a situation in which the only card Palestinians have to play is the card of violence. I think in view of the time, I'm going to save my defense of the Palestinian position. Perhaps there'll be some who would ask the question. And I'll just end by coming back to a point that you made earlier. I think that what we have undertaken to do with our vision is to somehow strike a balance between the 19th century and the 21st. We recognize, I think neither Dahlia nor I, tell me if I'm wrong, is a nationalist per se, right? And there aren't many people in our movement who are strong nationalists, either Palestinian or Israelis, who think that the national ideal is the most important ideal. But we recognize, as you were alluding to a minute ago, that we do not, in 2025, there or here or in my other country, the United States, we do not live in a post-national moment. We don't. We might wish nationalism away, but nationalism, national identity really matters to people. And so we give it space, and we recognize that self-determination matters. But we don't give it too much space. We also, to your point, we contain it. We, as you put it so beautifully, try to reconcile sovereignty and interdependence, national identity, and the idea of equality. And putting those things in tandem, to our minds, is not only the best approach, but the most realistic one.
Thank you so much for this. I think that it is very important you insisted, both of you, on the issue that the mobility, the mixity can create security, while on the other side, the walls, the separations, the designation of the other as enemy create insecurity. And I think that that was actually one of the lessons that Europe has learned from her own history. And this point has also many theoretical and normative implications actually for the political thinking. So thank you, both of you. And I think that now we can give the floor to Chibli Mallat. I will call him avocat internationaliste dans les deux sens du terme. Donc si vous m'entendez, cher Chibli, la parole est à vous. En anglais, je crois, oui.
Oui, je sais. Merci beaucoup, Hamit. Vous m'entendez là? Très bien. Well, it's all music to my ears. I don't want to take too much time because, as you will see in a moment, I think the weight of change is going to be inevitably Israeli-Palestinian, and that people from the neighborhood, at best, can help you solve the Israeli-Palestinian problem. The rest of the region comes to forms of peace. You solve all the problem between Israel and the neighboring states, the core issue will remain one that is solid and difficult and impossible to solve unless you head on, as you did, Omar and Dahlia, took it on with the most difficult issues put first. Now, I have two short directions to my little talk. One is how my own thinking have developed over 40 years of writing about the issue. One of the strong moments, and I was a supporter of Oslo, unlike someone like Edward Said, for instance. I always thought that progress must be attempted even if one is skeptical because of the underlying inequality of realpolitik. And so in a conference we held with a number of Israeli colleagues in London back in 1994-95, just around Oslo and the treaty with Jordan, I realized something that was absolutely evident, that those treaties that we had in 1993 and 1994 would only be the beginning of a large number of other treaties that would be necessary, considering the implication and the neighborliness of the populations in Israel-Palestine. And this led me to the book that Gisèle mentioned, where I thought that the way forward was a different type of Arab-Israeli peace. Again, one that you understand is based essentially on an agreement between Israeli and Palestinians, but also one where the development of the necessary successes that the Europeans had reached through iterations of the European community from the time it was in ECSA all the way to the Treaty of Lisbon, that's the Middle East façon Europe, was the way forward, in which liberty of movement and liberty of establishment, as Omar mentioned, are going to be key. And then in 2003, there was a conference, yet another conference in Germany. And I remember an old gentleman coming to me and say, look, you're Lebanese. How about us, we Israelis and you Lebanese joining the EU? Wouldn't that be a brilliant idea? I thought, of course, I'm ready for this. And that's, I penned my my name to what was called the Weidenfeld proposal, he shied away from following it. But it was something that was very meaningful, in particular because, God bless her, her courage. Hanan Ashray was saying, what about us, the Palestinians? What about us, the Palestinians? We want to be part of it as well. Then, of course, things went wrong, and October 7th happened. And again, the Arabs, and that's for a large part their fault, had turned their back on the Palestinian issue. And here it was again, with full blast and with an amount of violence that has surpassed all previous violence. And then I wrote a little piece published in America, where the key element, I thought, was that if in order to solve the Palestinian-Israeli issue, it has to be primarily perceived as a civil war. 120 or so years of civil war. And then that's why it's so difficult to solve. The civil wars are extremely difficult to solve. We know that from Ireland, we know that from India, Pakistan, we know that from all kinds of large-scale fights in the world still going on. And that insofar as the issue at core is one of civil war, then there must be a solution that is contingent on this acceptance. Of course, it was a war which one could perceive as an Iranian-Israeli war. It was also a Hezbollah Netanyahu war. It was a clash of civilizations. But the core issue of all of this is the element of civil war that needs to be addressed head front. And this is what this All for Land, Land for All, I read, is the essential contribution of what you've bravely done against an atmosphere which was particularly not conducive to such deep and humane questions that you were raising. And finally, intellectually, and this is where I want to respond to Omar, as I did in the beginning, which is, as a lawyer, I don't think there's anything between an independent state, a sovereign state, and a federation. It's either a federation or two sovereign states. I don't recognize in the world any system like this. But the agreement that I have with you is more important, which is that we have to conceive of the Confederation as a federation in the making, or if it fails, then there is a return to the national situation. That's exactly where we are now in Europe, where the attempts of de Villepin and the German and Joschka Fischer to go ahead with the United States of Europe collapsed, and after Brexit, there is a return to the national boundaries. It could have been different. It could have been a move towards a more federal Europe. So the confederation that we see in the making had a big hold, and hopefully, with the vote in Romania, there's going to be a new spirit there. So these are my main remarks in terms of the intellectual perception of the fight that you have been leading for 12 years against the odds inside the country. And I think if Gisèle doesn't mind, I'd like to say a few things about what to do now, but I might leave it for later, depending on what you wish.
In any case, we will have a couple of questions from the public. Maybe we can stop here and try to open the QA session.
Sorry, I've lost you here.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe we can stop here for a while and open the Q&A session. And I am sure that there will be some questions oriented or addressed to you too. I think that this issue of civil war is a very important issue. Already by 1917, both Bertrand Russell, who was a pacifist, and Ali Halevi, who was a French patriot, thought that what the war going on in Europe was a civil war, European civil war, already by 1917. Thank you so much. Now I will give floor to Gisèle, who was the main architect and the pillar actually of this meeting. She spent the last 10 days actually to organize all the details. And thereafter, And after Gisèle, I will give the floor to the president of École, who authorized us to have this meeting in this very peculiar
against
condition.
the police.
Gisèle,
Thank you so much. I just wanted to pick up what Romain Huret, our president, said, because among the signatories of the declaration, the 530, 156 are French, and of them I haven't counted, but many are from the École des Hautes Études. So I think there is a place here to open the discussion. And also all this initiative started because Yael Berda was invited by Hamit and myself as a visiting professor at the École. And we discussed with Thomas Piketty, who had written about A Land for All in Le Monde in November 2023, and this is how I discovered A Land for All. I mean, I regularly go to this country. I never heard of that, and so this is talking with Thomas, who included me in the discussions, that I got interest, and I got to meet Yael Berda, and then we invited her, and I think there is a lot of potential for continuing the discussion, as you say, the research aspect of because it's also interesting for research, but of course Chibli brings us back to reality, and we really also have to think about how to translate that. So of course the letter is the first step, and we will have to find the moment when we send it to the European Union and to whom we send it. Yael was hoping the way to have 1,000 signatories, so maybe, and we need other people supporting this in other countries. And I wanted also to say, because of the example of Bosnia, we have quite many people from Croatia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, Montenegro, Serbia who signed. Yes, and I think to them it's really meaningful to sign this from Croatia. So it was also because I was there and I was able to talk with people. But then people signed. So it's really meaningful. So I would like to thank again. First, Dahlia and Omar for taking from the time of their stay to Chibli for being with us and supporting us in this initiative from the beginning very, very strongly. To Hamit, who helped me organize all this event, to Romain, thanks to whom we were able to hold it against the police. I like this very much. and
taxi drivers.
No, they were with us. In this case, they were with us. And no, because the security was afraid that the taxi drivers would want to attack us, but I didn't think so. So, and to the CESSP and the CETOBAC, and to all the people who really took a lot of time to organize this meeting, thanks very much. And we have a small reception waiting for us, thanks to Estelle Girard, who organized it.